if you were going to have a transcript as well, you may have the transcript up on your screen. You can press the X in the corner to get rid of, in the corner of the transcript window, not the whole window, to get rid of that. But if you need that for any reason, then it should be there. Great. And over to you, Bart.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Naomi, and thanks for organising this event. Just very briefly on me, this is probably the last you'll hear about me because we're here really to talk to Daniel and find out a little bit more about what's brought him to where he is now. But I have just graduated from Birkbeck. I did the LLM qualifying law degree, and I wrote my dissertation on an aspect of family law, which was one of the reasons that I kind of got in touch with Daniel to begin with. And I used to practice as a child protection social worker in Hackney, and that was what kind of sparked my interest in family law in particular. And I am now doing the LPC course and will be a trainee at a city firm that also has a family department, and I hope that I might qualify into that seat, but I'm pretty open-minded about it. But I'm really kind of, as you might tell, passionate about family law in general, and it's been really exciting working with Daniel. So on that note, Daniel, if there are people here who might not know who you are, would you mind just giving a little introduction as to who you are and kind of what brought you to Birkbeck and where what you're sort of researching now?
Okay, yes, thank you. And thanks, Naomi and the Student Union for inviting me to take part in this initiative, which I think is a really lovely one. And thanks, Bart, for coming back to Birkbeck. It's always when students are graduating, they have an excuse to come back. And it was a real pleasure supervising your fantastic family law dissertation. Special. It was really great. Real pleasure that. So yes, my name's Daniel Monk, and I've been one of the academics in the School of Law at Birkbeck for coming up for 18 years, 19 years. And before that, I was a lecturer at Keele University. I studied law at university a long time ago, particularly a long time ago in terms of family law, because it was before the Children Act. It was at the time where most of family law was one of the subjects we spoke a lot about when I first studied family law in the early 80s was illegitimacy. And of course, that subject's kind of not really part of the curriculum very much anymore. And things that we talk a lot about in family law now weren't even in the textbooks when I studied family law. So that's kind of one of the reasons it's such an interesting subject. But having started studying family law, I always did enjoy the subject. But then I went on to do my articles of clerkship, which is now called being a trainee solicitor, for a solicitor's firm that specialised in entertainment law. So I was sort of writing contracts for people who were writing plays and songs about love and relationships and all the subjects I was interested, but I was just writing their contracts and negotiating whether they should have 2% for the t-shirts on the tour or 2.5% for the t-shirts on the tour. And I sort of found that legal practice wasn't for me, and I just wanted to, I think, stand back from the world and ask questions more than get involved in the way in which practitioners do. Maybe because I did it young, I don't know, I'm not sure. I think there's, we can talk a bit about that relationship between legal practice and legal academia, particularly family law. But I had never thought, if somebody had told me when I was doing my first degree that I'd have ended up an academic, I simply would not have believed it. I mean, it was the last thing in the world I wanted to do when I was studying for at university. It's just happened that way. I guess that happens with lots of people. You don't plan where you're going to end up, and it's often unexpected.
I mean, you just sort of touched on that relationship between legal practice and the kind of academic life, and so as you've kind of lived through both realities, how do both sides talk to each other now, both kind of internally and then also in practice?
Yeah, it's the relationship between legal academia and legal practice is it's a real relationship. So it's a complicated relationship, and it's been a complicated relationship for well over 100 years. Often the profession has an expectation of what legal academia will provide in terms of vocational training for people that are going to work in their offices. And legal academia has perceives itself much more as an academic discipline with a different relationship altogether. You know, when we teach law, we treat it in the same way we would be treating history or English or sociology or another subject. And delineating what legal academia actually is has been an ongoing process. It's changed quite a lot. Certainly in the 1960s, all the new universities started teaching law as a more of a sociological subject. You had sort of law in context movement emerged. I was an undergraduate at Warwick University, which is really one of the places where law in context started, and it was really radical because it put the law school in the social sciences faculty. So lots of new law schools always made sure that law was part of humanities or part of social sciences. And that was really sending out a message that it's not just about vocational training for the profession. So there's kind of a complicated relationship there. And I think in some ways, the move away from the profession that's happened in legal academia has very positive things. It's opened legal scholarship up to a wider range of disciplines and ways of thinking about law. At the same time, I think a lot of people feel that some of the valuable conversations that happen between legal practitioners and legal academics has been lost a bit. So you kind of need to keep both balls in the air at the same time. The importance of legal academia not just being about vocational training and actually being a really rich, complex social science, humanity subject. And at the same time, recognizing that you can learn a lot from
Oh, I'm back.
So I'm back, I think. Yeah.
Yep,
Sorry.
I'm back as well.
Some of the research subjects that my research questions have emerged from practice. So I started about a few years ago, I started researching inheritance. And I think that my interest in inheritance as a research subject probably emerged from in the late 80s and early 90s, being one of the volunteer will writers for the Terence Higgins Trust, and wrote, many wills in hospitals on deathbeds for young men, mainly young gay men dying of AIDS at that period. And I hadn't really thought about it as a research subject of something that I'd done in practice. And I thought it's interesting nobody had written about that kind of experience. So that linked into a research subject. And I suppose in other areas, when I was researching home education and siblings law, I very much informed by the questions that social workers and local authority professionals and children in care are asking, but academics aren't really necessarily listening to people's experiences on the ground. So I quite like when I'm meeting professionals or local authority people working in education to say to them, well, if you had time to think about something that you're dealing with in your day-to-day practice, what would it be? And often it's very different from the things that academics choose to write about.
I guess there's two things that's come to mind as you were talking. One is that, well, I was just reflecting on, and this is not meant to be a PR tool for Birkbeck, but that actually Birkbeck did provide quite a unique, I think, qualifying law experience compared to, say, my peers now that are doing the GDL. I think it's really striking how different my kind of legal training was to theirs, which was very much about, I think, meeting the criteria of the firms that are paying for their training contracts and having very set checklists of data that they need to kind of memorize, as opposed to engaging critically with criminal law, for example, or a topic that comes up in contracts even. And I think we might later on in our conversation maybe revisit that experience you had writing wills, because I think a lot has come from that that's been quite fruitful for you in some of the things that you've written. But as you were talking, I wondered whether much of the bridging that's going on is just down to you as a person, or are there formal institutions and organizations out there that facilitate those kind of conversations between academics and practitioners?
There are a couple of formal committees that link the Solicitors Regulation Authority and the Law Society with academics, but very few academics or practitioners take part in those. They're very much quite a very high level committee stage. Apart from that, it really is up to individuals.
Right.
I have colleagues who are very involved with activist groups who may be bringing legal actions, and colleagues who aren't. I mean, it is really, so it is a personal thing actually, and I think that's kind of one of the nice things about being an academic. You can choose which conversations you want to have and who you want to have conversations with. And I think certainly in my academic career, that's varied a lot. I think when I started, I probably didn't have any conversations with people in practice for at least the first decade. I didn't at all, probably. And it kind of came about later. So, and I've become sort of more interested in that. I think I sort of threw myself into theory at the beginning of being an academic. I think I was really interested in big ideas and concepts and frameworks. And then I'm not less interested in that, but I suppose as years have gone on, I'm kind of more interested in kind of just using that in a way and applying it and using it as tools for developing conversations. But I think, you know, academics have their own trajectories and research goes in different directions. That's one of the things of the job.
I think maybe if we sort of move on to some of the directions that have cropped up, and I should probably say that we'll definitely try and leave 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if people have got any questions as we're going along, please hold on to them. But maybe if we can go back to the experience you had of kind of writing wills, and I think that was a good example of a kind of intersectionality that you write about in one paper that you've written on, and you used E.M. Forster as a tool to kind of make a point, and I wondered if you could just, for those of the audience that haven't read it, talk about what you did there in terms of using literature as a discipline to engage with a legal question, and then some of the conclusions that you came to.
Yeah, thanks. That's kind of a methods question, which
more of a methods question.
One quick, before I talk about Forster, one quick sentence about that. I think when I studied law as an undergraduate, even as a postgraduate, I don't think I ever heard the word methods mentioned once. I think that's probably changed now in legal education, but traditionally lawyers don't really pay much attention to method. And what's quite nice about it, probably get in trouble saying that, but what's quite the good side of that is lawyers are very promiscuous with their methods, and I think that's quite a positive thing. So in terms of inheritance, I suddenly found myself thinking, oh, I want to write about inheritance. And, you know, and in approaching that, I did some empirical research, interviewing solicitors. I did some doctrinal research, looking at case law. I did some literary research, reading lots of novels. And I did some archival research by going away and finding people's wills to think about. So those are 4 different methods. And I sort of like the idea of saying, well, I'm interested in X, and how am I going to look at it from different perspectives? So in terms of one thing, I don't remember why I ended up thinking Forster's will would be interesting to look at. Well, you know, sometimes it's really hard to remember why one does things or where the idea came from. I've always liked E.M. Forster. I've always thought he's a really complicated writer, much more complicated than people think. I think for those who have only seen the films and all those costume drama lush movies, don't let that, I mean, if you enjoyed them, great, but don't let them make you think that's what E.M. Forster's about. He's a much more ambivalent, complicated writer. And I think he troubles lots of ideas about modernism and liberalism, and people get lots of different things out of him.
And marriage and relationships, and Howard's End especially is, very...
He has a lot to say about everything. I mean, for some people, he's, you know, precursor of gay rights. And then for some people, he's absolutely a closeted old-fashioned homosexual. And for others, he's a real passionate anti-imperialist. And for some people, he's totally pre-colonizing in terms of the way he perceives the world. So people project everything onto him. And I find that leaves quite a lot of space to thinking about. I was quite... When I was doing the research and I realized I could find I think I read one of his novels, The Longest Journey, and lots of his novels were about wills. So lots of Edwardian and Victorian novelists, they all wrote about wills. Wills is a plot line and in dramas. And I thought it was interesting that even though he writes a lot about wills, indeed in Howard's End, there's a dinner party scene where all these Bloomsbury types are sitting around a table discussing what should you do with your money. And then I went to read some of his biographies, and it struck me that even though he'd written so much about will writing in his novels, none of the biographers had actually looked up his will. And I think his famous novel Morris, which was published posthumously after he's died, I think people have always hooked on that as being his last word, as being his will. So I kind of provocatively titled my article Ian Forster's Will, an overlooked posthumous publication. And I wanted to say that will writing is a form of self-writing. It's a way of telling stories about relationships. And I think stories about relationships is really why I'm interested in family law.
Well, that was my next question. So to sort of to go back to family law specifically, maybe for people who don't know anything about the discipline, what is it? I mean, what's in it?
It's a really good question. That there's this thing called family law, capital F, capital L. And if you picked up a standard family law textbook, it would have marriage, divorce. Now you have stuff about cohabitation rights. Most would look a bit about domestic abuse, or that's relatively new. In the old days, domestic abuse wouldn't be part of family law. And then you talk about child law and child protection law. But family law, capital L, capital L, is very different from family life and law. So there's lots of issues that relate to families that don't fall within the traditional family law curriculum, or indeed family law practitioners wouldn't teach. So even though my work is all really about family life, very little of the things I've researched are actually would fit into a family law textbook. So I've written about school exclusions and a lot about home education, which is the relationship between parents and the state, and inheritance disputes and sibling relationships. Now, all of those things are really important parts of the way in which people experience families, or have conflicts with families, or negotiate what they mean by families. So they're all sort of at the margins of family law. And one thing I'm quite interested in, I think a lot of critical scholars are, is very much interested in challenging the boundaries of traditional subject matters. And asking, why do we have this thing called crime and tort so separately? What is the relationship between family law and contract law? And I think once you start asking the question you just asked, what is family law, that begs leads to loads of interesting conversations. Why is marriage not just contract law? Discuss, is it just contract law, or should it just be contract law, and then it always ends up leading on to, it's the question about what does the state, what does the sense of collective or community want from those relationships.
And to what extent do you think that, I guess, your engagement in the kind of academic side of family law is also a form of advocacy, or a form of moving family law in forward, without getting into discussions about progress and all that?
Yeah.
Just to what extent is it a form of advocacy?
Well, one example happened quite recently. I'm one of the editors of Child and Family Law Quarterly, which is the specialist journal in the field. And in the editorial board, we often have sort of quite heated conversations about whether something really fits within the remit of our journal. So this new special issue of Child and Family Law Quarterly, which has just been published, just coming out this month, focuses on sexual relationships and violent relationships in personal life. And some of my colleagues on the journal thought, no, that's criminal law, that's not really family law. And others, including me, were saying, no, that really is family law. And I suppose when I was involved with writing a textbook, which was a fascinating experience, I wrote a family law textbook with Brenda Hale.
Yeah.
Which was great fun. I suggested rather tentatively, and we were co-authors, but I was very junior. That wasn't an equal relationship. I suggested, could we put something about friendship and law's ambivalent relationship with friendship into the family law textbook, which was, and she accepted that, and that was really fun to do that. And she'd been one of the first people, 2 generations earlier, who had asserted the importance of including domestic violence within the family law curriculum. And then, me being a couple of generations later was saying, well, I think we can now put something else into the subject matter. And when I did the research about siblings, if you pick up a family law textbook, the word siblings hardly appears. Some of them have an index reference, but very, very little. But when I was talking to children in care and charities and organizations where they have a voice, they said this really mattered. You know, the sibling relationship really matters to children in care. So actually doing research on the subject was saying, no, this really matters. This is important. This should be something that's considered. And judges and social workers, you know, should be putting more weight on that relationship. So in that sense, yeah, there is a form of advocacy, yeah.
And I suppose in that particular example of family law, we enter into that kind of intersection, I suppose, between the state and the family and the private life, and that's an area that I'm very interested in, having sort of worked at the on the fulcrum of both, and I know it's a very live debate, and I think will only increase in sort of intensity, especially perhaps given the effects of the murder of Arthur Lavinia Hughes and how society comes to understand that really tragic case. So, I mean, what's your kind of understanding at the moment of the unhappy sort of marriage between state intervention and personal, private family life? Where do you think we are at the moment in terms of the amount of privacy society is willing to give up for the sake of protecting children?
Oh, there's lots there. And I should say, well, you know, I just want to go back to something you said at the beginning about Birkbeck law degree being slightly different. I think one of the reasons is because we have students like you, and our students are acting, you know, working as social workers, working in different professions, and they bring that to the subject matter. The way you ask the question about where are we with privacy and state intervention sets up the framework for which human rights thinks about that subject. And it asserts that there is this thing called private life and there is this state intervention. I guess I've always been quite interested by a theoretical way, a different theoretical framework that says intervention and non-intervention is an unhelpful binary. That actually non-intervention is a form of intervention.
Right.
Non-intervention is about saying the power relationships that are going on there are okay, and we don't need to intervene because actually we like what's going on there.
Right.
So before the state intervened in the family at all, it wasn't neutral about the family. It was very clear that fathers and husbands' rights should be absolute because that was considered the natural order of things under a patriarchal framework. That wasn't a form of indifference. So non-intervention isn't indifference. So I think you can trouble intervention and non-intervention in a way. At the same time, I suppose I haven't given up on a sort of a fundamental liberal idea, which is there is something called privacy. I think it's something that we experience. People do talk about their private life. There are things we don't want to share. Some things do feel private and we want them to be private. And I think that's always one of the challenges for family law. People always try and change. There used to be a period where it was very fashionable not to call family law academic courses family law. We sort of avoid using the F word. It was seen as very traditional to call family. So you call it domestic relations law or intimate citizen law or adult anything other than use the F word. But I think I've kind of moved a bit away from that because I think people don't, in their day-to-day lives, most people don't go around talking about their adult relationships or their intimate citizenship. But people do use the word family. It may be they ran away from the family, they hate their family, violent family, it was awful. But people do use that word family. So there's a tenacity about it. And I think there's a link between that and that idea of the state's role. People do experience, I suppose it's the idea of starting from the bottom up, listening to people. People do experience those things as separate. I think a lot of non-intervention, the whole question can't be separated from poverty and socioeconomic inequalities. Non-intervention favours the laissez-faire neoliberal economic model. I think that's what social workers experience at the hard end of it. And I think that, obviously the tragic murder that's in the news at the moment is heartbreaking and appalling. And I think possibly if people had listened to the guidance of things beforehand, could have been avoided. I do think it's important for people to note and remember that I think social workers, we don't hear about all the lives that social workers save.
Absolutely.
And actually, compared to America and lots of other countries, we have an incredibly low rate of child murder. It's a shocking statistic. I can't remember what it is, the number of kids who are murdered by adults. And of course, it's horrific. But it's actually very low. It's never been as low. So there's a lot of really good social work going on, saving children's lives.
No, absolutely. That was one of the things I was reflecting on in the days following the news, was that that we and of course there's never a right time to have this kind of conversation either, because it's difficult to think of a worse crime than parents, especially killing their own child. But that such an event should have such a power or weight over a profession, such as with Baby P, and all the other sort of major serious case reviews that have reached headlines, I think is just really interesting that a profession is shaped by the times, for one reason or another, a child has slipped through the net and has suffered, as opposed to there being more celebrations of what works and when it does go well. Thinking in my own practice of the many children that who unfortunately are not living with their parents, but are safe, and that no one will ever hear about. And yes, so it'll be interesting to see, I suppose, what happens in the light of the serious case reviews, and whether
I think there's a question about the role of the media there as well.
Yes.
How professionals operate in the shadow of the media. One of the things I was writing about in terms of the sibling research was very much about the risk to children of adoption and how that damages the sibling relationship. That it's very hard to get any media interest in the loss of those relationships. Obviously, I mean, it's understandable that the murder of a child is going to be a huge story, but it's interesting what stories get picked up on and which ones don't. And I think family law is a particularly interesting subject to think about in relation to media stories. I mean, I always tell my family law students, you must watch EastEnders. I mean, I love soap operas. One of the reasons I ended up with family law, because I do quite like soap operas. And I do melodrama. I think melodrama is really serious. I think melodrama is really important. I've always wanted to salvage intellectually the importance of melodrama. And you get a lot of that in family law cases. I mean, this tragic murder is a sensational melodrama. And that's not to belittle it, of course.
No, and there are many kind of archetypal tropes that come up in this. There's women and the role of women, and that a woman could be so cruel, and you've got lots of things that the big questions.
There's this construction of folk devils. This is very new, but also very ancient. The dangerous woman, the woman who isn't maternal, and also a child being murdered. You said there's nothing worse than a child being murdered. Well, I mean, it has a particular resonance for various reasons. That the notion of childhood innocence, that it has it comes from somewhere, those ideas. And I think one of the things I've always tried to do in research is try and introduce into child law the sociology of childhood, trying to think, well, let's not take it for granted that this subject that we're writing about doesn't have deep, complex roots, to unpack things a bit.
And I guess to get you to spell it out further, why should we do that? Why is it wrong to just stop the conversation at saying, there's nothing worse than killing a child? Why should we probe that?
Because I think it can help us, always dangerous using the word us and we. I think it can help it encourages a more reflective approach. It can encourage, I think it forces us to ask, why are we calling something a problem? And I think it throws light on what we don't perceive to be a problem. So I think it brings to the fore silences. It brings to the fore common sense. Common sense is seen to be outside academia, when you're having a general chat with people, that's just obvious and common sense. And in academia, common sense is a dangerous thing because you need to understand where it's from, because it's very powerful. And if you're interested in questioning power and questioning the way in which things are defined, I'm being very Foucauldian here without going into detail about it, you need to understand how subjects are problematized and how things are represented. You need to unpack things, because then you can understand what's not being spoken about, what that perhaps should be spoken about, and also understand some of the solutions we develop, the programs that get developed in response to terrible things happening are defined by how you define the problem. So if you look at how you define the problem, then you can figure out different responses. So I think if you perceive the problem of child murder to be mad individuals, or particularly traumatized, dangerous individuals, you're not going to look at broader socioeconomic problems. If you individualize something, you're not going to look at the broader social structural responses to things.
Yeah, brilliant. And do you find that, I suppose this is a bit of a leading question, but I'll ask it anyway. Does that make you at times quite controversial?
Yes, a couple of times people, yeah. I mean, oddly enough, sometimes there's a tension, certainly in child law area, there is a tension between the child savers and the children's rights activists and the academics who are more informed by the sociology of childhood. And sometimes that creates a polarity of views. I think there was one children's rights activist who was saying that my work was cynical. I think they were arguing why there was a lot of arguments, lots of activists saying children should have more rights in education and hammering that point home. And I wasn't so sure about that. I was saying, well, the reasons we don't have is because we understand childhood to be the purpose of education. It is still the empty vessel idea of education. You have to do something much more radical to imagine a method of rights. So in the idea of thinking that children's rights, the lack of children's rights is functional and pragmatic, can often get you in trouble, because if you question, yeah. I think, yeah, any kind of pulling the rug from under people's feet is problematic, but I think that good academics should do it to themselves as well. I do kind of think of queer theory bits that I'm quite into, is the idea of, you're constantly pulling the rug from under your own feet. The minute you get too comfortable, the minute something becomes an orthodoxy, quite set, where the framework is clear, where the subject is clear, where you've produced a clear discourse, whether it's a radical discourse or it's not just about critiquing traditional, conventional, conservative ideas. If you get too comfortable, I think you're doing something a bit wrong. You shouldn't be too comfortable.
It's quite refreshing to hear these days. What are some of the things that make you uncomfortable now? What are you interested in now that's sort of inspiring you? So.
Well, I've just finished a piece of research about royal divorces, which I think I'd like to do more on. I mean, I know it sounds like a very camp subject to start with. In a sense it is, but in a sense, I suppose I've had the task of trying to, through all the things I've written about, the things that lots of people don't write about. I'm interested in things that don't get spoken about. And I was interested in something like royal divorces, where there's so much media attention. I mean, arguably too much, possibly, about the personal lives of royalty. And I just wanted to take it really seriously, and thinking about how royal divorces across history is a way in to unpack the institution of marriage and monarchy. Yes. And to think about those two institutions, marriage and monarchy, which are incredibly tenacious, resilient institutions in the face of everybody predicting the demise of both of them. And I'm thinking divorce is where those institutions are really challenged. So I kind of like taking a subject that seems a bit obscure or a bit silly or something, and then taking it seriously, taking things seriously that aren't necessarily taken seriously. I think that's something I quite like doing.
And on that paper, I think I've looked at the one where you're looking at marriage and the monarchy. I mean, where do you think the presence of divorce within such a concrete institution like the monarchy, what do you think that did both for the monarchy and for marriage as an institution as well? So what were sort of the conclusions that you came to?
I think divorce has both saved the monarchy and at different times been a threat to monarchy, and it's how the monarchy has navigated divorce is a way in which the monarchy has survived. But I also think that then mirrors the way in which marriage itself has changed. So, I mean, in a sense, looking at royalty is the opposite of social history. The whole point of social history is you don't look at kings and queens and princes, you look at real ordinary people's lives. But I think, because if people are talking about royal divorce, I thought that is a form of social history. So I think even at that level, it becomes a form of social history. I also think it's a way of talking about constitutional reforms as well. I don't think I've quite answered your question there. It's funny, you said, what did I conclude? And I'm really bad at conclusion. Everyone has their strengths and weaknesses. I love writing introductions. I love framing the subject and opening the field and say, I'm interested in this and I want to develop a conversation between this practice and that discipline. And I love writing introductions. I'm hopeless at conclusions. In fact, so when you asked me what did I conclude, I think that sent me into a panic.
Sorry. Well, where do you see? Well, I mean, where do you see the sort of institution of marriage going? I mean, we're now in a place in this country where it is no longer the preserve of a man and a woman, and that it is possible to have many marriages in a lifetime without there being public shame. Where,
I think,
and then we've got this other entity of civil partnership. Is that just going to die out? Are we all going to just, what do you?
It's really hard to predict, but I think marriage is fascinating, and I even with ones, opposed to it, hate it, love it, whatever. I think it's an extraordinarily interesting institution to think about. This ancient institution that's pre-Christianity, is there in the classical world, and what you can trace through history just by looking at that institution is phenomenal in terms of social change. I think we're moving. I mean, for those who don't know, the divorce law is brand new divorce law is being introduced in April, and adultery is being removed from the English law. I think that's hugely important. So on April the 6th, 2022, adultery disappears. So anybody who wants to commit adultery, don't have many months to do it. After April the 6th, it just doesn't exist in law anymore. And I kind of think that's fascinating, that the adultery is gone. I think what we're moving away from is moving away from a status model to think of the relationship, more to an emotional idea of responsible behavior model. I think it's about what's happened is this attempt to reconcile the search for happiness, authenticity, a word I hate, and being true to yourself somehow becomes more important than an older model of adultery and living in sin and those things. And I think it's that people are way in which individuals are negotiating their lives and think about things is really interesting. That shift is occurring. In terms of civil partnership, civil partnerships were only invented as a stopgap because it was felt that society wasn't ready for same-sex marriage. But now, of course, same-sex civil partnerships have been open to opposite-sex relationships. And there was a huge campaign. I didn't agree with that. I wasn't really on that side. I didn't think it was a good idea, really. But it's happened. And I think it's really, what might happen, now we've got these two almost identical institutions, marriage and civil partnership. Very few countries have these two institutions coexisting. And I think what might happen is that civil partnerships gets used for other things. So it's set up just for same-sex relations, and then it's been extended to opposite-sex relations. It may be the vehicle through which we can then open up law to polygamous relationships or perhaps other forms of commitment, so siblings living together or people, cohabitees, who aren't in a conjugal relationship. And I think perhaps the removal of adultery and having civil partnership, which is a relationship not premised on sexual relationship, that may be a space that we go to. I don't know. It's very hard to tell, but we may go in that direction.
And is that a sort of way of removing sex from an institutionalized kind of form, and sex can be this sort of obviously within certain still within certain legal bounds of responsibility to one another and so on and safety, but generally taking it out of the equation of
Yeah, because I think, I mean, the origin, I mean, it was quite funny. There were some gay men who were very upset that they weren't allowed to have adultery in civil partnerships. And even in gay marriage, same-sex marriage, adultery never applied because nobody wanted to define what adultery would mean for a same-sex relationship. And they felt aggrieved. They felt they had a right, you know, waving an equality flag. And we want to, which I thought was absurd. But anyway, I think that we are moving away. I think, I mean, at the basis of sex in family law and the obsession with family law cases around adultery and sex all come back to legitimacy. It's all about illegitimacy and legitimacy, that status. I mean, that haunts family law, is this obsession with illegitimacy. As I said, when I started studying family law in the early 80s, a whole chunk of the family law textbook was about the status of illegitimacy. And I think adultery is the remnant of that. You can only understand law's obsession with adultery is about illegitimacy. It doesn't really make sense otherwise. And I think we're just slowly moving away from that haunting of illegitimacy.
It's a really great lead into sort of how it might be a good idea to wrap up this little part of our conversation, thinking about, okay, so when you started studying law, the illegitimacy and legitimacy were the sort of buzz topics. What do you see the next 10, 15 years being like for someone interested in family law? What are some of the topics you think are going to be really hot topics?
Ooh, I think cohabitation is still constantly there. I don't know. I think that we will come to a point where cohabitation is going to be more widely recognised in the legal system. I don't know when it will have. The law commission has said for years it should happen. Legal practitioners have said it for years it should happen. So there's a huge movement in that direction. But to date, no politicians simply won't budge on it. But I think we are going to move there. I think inheritance, and perhaps I played a part in that in a tiny way, is going to become more important in family law. It's always seen as quite marginal, but if you look at where people are having disputes amongst their families, in practice, it's a huge growth area. And while in the divorce courts, they only really look at hugely rich people, inheritance disputes can be often about very modest sums of money. And I think what's happening is the effect of people in their 70s and 80s are where you have the highest proportion of owner-occupiers.
Yeah.
So it's a demographic model. Now, I don't think we'll ever get back to, you know, what is it, 75% of people owning their property in a particular older age category. I don't think that's going to happen again. It may have been a blip. But I think that there's changes in the way in which property works, changes in the way in which people live in terms of housing arrangements, because of that socioeconomic shift. I think there'll be more intergenerational households, I think, are going to come back. Not out of choice. I mean, they can be, you know, people can say how marvelous they are, but I don't think, you know, it's happening because of economics. And I think that's happening. So I think it'll be the ripples. Family law will have to pick up, you know, the ripples of what happenings in changing property ownership and changing ways in which we live in homes and houses. The shift of the household. In a sense, we're going back to earlier household models. And I think law will have to respond to that.
It's been fascinating, Daniel. Thank you. I said that I wanted to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions. Maybe before that, have you got any advice to anyone who is either studying law, thinking about going into legal research, or going into practice? I mean, it's a big question.
Interested in doing research, follow your curiosity. You know, I said, what do you don't know? I always think it's important to start with something that you don't know rather than something that you do know. Think about something which you don't know where you stand on an issue, that you're not sure about, where you don't feel passionately one way or the other on an issue, and you really want to find out. I think that's quite a good place to start for research. I think some of the most exciting research comes from that starting point rather than, I think we should be there. You know, we're at point A to B and we should be at Z, and I'm going to make the argument as to why we should get to Z. I think when you have you don't know what, you know, pull the rug from under your feet a little bit. I think that can help. I think it makes more interesting research sometimes. Look at subjects where there don't seem to be a lot happening. You know, don't follow the crowd sometimes.
Yeah.
Outside of things. Talk to people who aren't in academia and find out what other people are interested in and see if there's a gap between that and what's happening in practice. I think that's part of a move towards involving people in research at an earlier stage and actually developing research. And also I think academic research is much more exciting than it ever used to be in terms of the types of outputs you can do. You can curate exhibitions. Think about the visual aspect of it. You know, academic outputs are really becoming much more fun than they ever used to be. So have fun with it. It should be, you know, it's got to be enjoyable. In terms of practice, I think you just learn as much about it as possible. Read the trade journals, the practitioner journals, find out what people are looking about. Go to as many events as possible. You know, just keep your eyes and ears open the whole time. Brilliant.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I don't know if Naomi wants to come back in and sort of, I think we've got about 7 minutes or so. If there are any questions from people here that they'd like to put to you. I think there's Elizabeth.
There's someone typing something. I see Louise has just, Kathy's typed a question. Kathy's saying, I'm a new student on the higher certificate of legal studies. Are there legal academic conversations about the folk devils and common sense? Yeah, there's lots of writing about that, Kathy. Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of folk devils is quite an old one, but certainly in the area of child law, there's quite a lot about it. So if you send me an email, I'm happy to send you some references to that. Elizabeth, you've got your hand up.
Hi, Daniel. Very quickly, what sort of results do you have to have in order to feel that you are good enough to pursue later studies or a PhD? Because sometimes you have this stereotypical way, oh, okay, I can only do that and have a life in academia if I am a first-class outstanding student. Is that true, or is this just my imagination and my feelings of insecurity clouding my judgment?
Well, it's great you mentioned insecurity. I think we should all talk about insecurity much more. I've been plagued by imposter syndrome forever, you know.
Yeah.
Terrifying. You know, if I ever get an article accepted by a very eminent journal, I just think they were probably desperate and they had a gap. The reviewer didn't read it carefully enough, and you know, just can't quite believe it. So yeah, I think academia is an environment that pushes the button of insecurities hugely. So you know, it's important to share that and talk about that more, I think. Okay, so in answering your question about that, it's a very competitive. I think it's become a lot more competitive. You know, I'm from an earlier generation. I mean, I didn't have a first. I got a first in a dissertation at master's level, but I didn't. You know, I didn't get a first in my degree. But you know, I think you probably couldn't get into academia through the route that I went into it now. I think it's become harder. So it has become tougher. I think, you know, a first is a good doors to open, but it's not the be all and end all, you know. And I think what people have to look to, have you demonstrated you've an ability to do something at a good level rather than overall? Because people are generally good at something and not good at something else. And if you can show you've been good in one area, that attests to your ability in other things.
Yeah, so I'm working hard. I'm in my second year now, but you know, I just want to have to understand better what the options that are available to us, because I don't think that at this stage I have made a decision about the direction I want to go. I have come to law very late in life. I'm a HR practitioner by trade, so I worked many years, and that's how my interest in law has arisen from my practice in employment law. But I'm curious about many different areas of law, and the more that I progress in my studies, I get more and more excited with different modules that I attend. So it's difficult for me.
Yeah. Well, what's really good is you've got practical experience. Now that already puts you way ahead of lots of other people. And that's, as I said, I was saying to Bart just before, that's what Birkbeck students stand up for. They might not have the traditional educational route in different ways, but practical experience is hugely valuable. So find a way of communicating that to whoever you work for. Definitely.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Tam, in the chat, you said, how do you make conclusions so far? Do you think universities could lead the way? Okay, how do I make conclusions? Oh gosh. Well, once an editor of a journal said, Danny, you've just got to get off the fence on this issue. About an article about home education. Should home educators have to register or not? And I was umming and ahhing and blah, 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 looking at arguments both sides. In the end, I did come down and said, yes, they should actually have to register. So it's something I just got off the fence. And I think law in practice, and when you're drafting law requires you to get off the fence, actually. You know, and judges have to get on, you know, should this child be taken into care? Should this child not be taken into care? We may critique binaries in academia, but practice in medicine does come down. Yes, this child adoption is going to take place. No, it isn't. That's a binary. A lot of decisions in practice are crude binaries, which is one of the reasons why they're really difficult. And Louise, you also said, do you think universities could lead the way of home learning? I think it's been incredibly exciting what's happened. I've just set up a new short course for professionals working for local authorities, and it's for professionals coming from all around the country. And it's been great. You know, couldn't have done it before. You know, I would never have known how to. I've suddenly got the skills to do things. There are fantastic advantages of virtual and home learning, and there are disadvantages. And I think what we're trying to do is just trying to make the best of both of them. And it's a juggling exercise, and we won't get it right all the time. I've got students with disabilities who've contacted me saying it's been amazing online. They would have had to drop out if they hadn't had the possibility of doing online. And then I've got students with other disabilities saying, I can't cope with online, I need to come in. They're both right. And I had a student who has a single parent mum, and she says she loves coming into the university. It's the only time where she feels this is time for her as a parent, and she doesn't have to be the mum, she doesn't have to be the employer. She's actually a student, and that's the only time she gets it. And at the same time, she said, but if there hadn't been online, since it's been online, I haven't missed anything. So, you know, there's no right or wrong answers. We're just constantly juggling that. And I just think that's the way we have to live with that, I think. Fernando's saying, have you ever encountered critiques that render the relationship between the law with humanities or queer theory less valid or credible than the knowledge originated from different sources? Yes, in some ways. I think it's about having conversations, and difficult conversations. I think it's about being prepared to accept that that question goes to the heart of the question about what is the role of theory in research, and it's not just queer theory but all theory. And there's a danger of all theories that they can become grand narratives.
Yeah.
You know the classic, Marxism as a grand narrative, or liberalism as, these grand narratives that get imposed, and everything that is heard through that narrative and understood in that way. And as I think there's a problem with all grand narratives. Now, some theories set themselves up as being, and I think one of the wonderful things about queer theory is it wants to trouble grand narratives, and that's where queer theory does something brilliantly. But I think the problem sometimes it becomes its own grand narrative, and it becomes its own orthodoxies.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I think gives rise to the tension sometimes. But I think that's where you have conversations within them. There is no authentic queer voice. There's authentic. That's why I don't like authenticity. I don't like it as a personal growth concept, and I don't like it as an intellectual concept.
Yeah.
Really suspicious of authenticity. I just don't believe it, and I suppose that's kind of where I'm at with that. Joanna, you've got your hand up.
Oops. Hi there. Thanks for that, Daniel. That was really interesting. Lots of questions kind of throughout, but to pick up on a kind of an early point about the relationship that you like to engage in with practitioners, which is not a natural kind of relationship to have when you're in academia. And I've worked in the policy side of things and are equally kind of frustrated from that side. But I was interested, as I'm interested in the kind of interfaces between sectors and the problems that kind of come up between them. But I was interested in any kind of particularly consistent questions or frustrations or complaints maybe that those people that you speak to that inspire your work in academia kind of are, what they are, if there's anything particularly kind of, do you know what I mean, that's so just those kind of frustrations that practitioners have, and particularly anything that relates to the functioning of the state, I suppose, as well.
Huge stuff, and I think we've got about a minute or 2 minutes to answer the question. But okay, I think there's processes of translation. I mean, if it could go down a whole conversation about systems theory and autopoiesis, about inevitably there's interference between different professional discourses. And I think it is frustrating sometimes. You have to translate things. And I think academics have to have a bit of humility, actually, and a little humility and recognise what they don't know. And I think one of the things I really love about public engagement law is not public engagement law, just public engagement generally, is recognising how much you can learn from talking to people in our academics. I think academics have the tendency sometimes to think that they're the great experts and they're the people who spent years researching the subject and they know about it. And just sometimes you have to remind yourself that you don't know things as well. You have to listening really hard helps. I think that's all I'll say in the last few minutes there, but happy to carry on that conversation, Joanna. I'm sure we will.
Thank you.
All right. I think then all that's really left is to thank everyone for coming. And big thanks to Daniel and Bart for agreeing to take part in this and for such an amazing discussion. This was absolutely wonderful, and I'm really grateful for you both taking time out of your day to come and do this.
It's a great pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great. Thanks. Really nice. Thank you so much, Bart, and thanks, Naomi, and thanks everybody else. That's great. I've just seen a comment from Kepra. Absolutely. Send me an email about that. Really exciting. Arts and dramatics, legal studies. Yeah, talk to me. Got links I can send you to wonderful performance artists who work with law. So yeah, let's carry on that conversation. Okay, lovely.
Love this. Okay, I'm going to stop recording now.